Well, I decided to make a YouTube video to do this rather than a blog post, just to see about trying out a new medium. Also because I'm responding to and rebutting a YouTube video, quite honestly. So I thought it appropriate to do so in the same medium. The video I'm responding to is by What Culture Gaming, and it references 10 things that some little British simp thinks Red Dead Redemption 3 absolutely should have. And when I first started the video, and it was suggested to me by YouTube, I've seen a few What Culture videos here and there, but I don't tend to like them very much. But it was suggested to me by YouTube, and because I'm really into Red Dead Online right now. In particular, I was a late adopter. We got Red Dead 2, we pre-ordered it. We had it right away, but I only played single player for a long time and only got into online recently. So I'm really kind of into Red Dead right now. So I watch a lot of videos on YouTube. I had that one recommended to me. I was prepared to hate everything that he said and disagree with it. It turns out that at least for a while, I was agreeing with most of what he said, but sure enough, he turned on me and I started disagreeing with an awful lot of what he said. So I thought I would rebut what he said. And it's, nothing personal. I just don't think that there's any reason that it needs to be done. But I thought, what the heck? I would like to say what I think Red Dead, where it should go after this in terms of new titles. And, first of all, I disagree, and we'll get to this when we get to one of his points. I disagree that there should be a Red Dead Redemption 3. Keep in mind that the series is actually 3 titles so far. The first one was Red Dead Revolver, and then there was Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2 are very intertwined in terms of their plots and their characters. Red Dead Revolver takes place a better part of a generation earlier, and it is a totally different cast of characters, although some of the locations appear to be the same. And it's an older game, and obviously they kind of redesigned a lot of stuff for Red Dead Redemption when they made it. And when they made Red Dead Redemption 2, they were much more conscious of being a sequel to Red Dead Redemption, probably because Red Dead Redemption was such an incredibly huge hit at the time. So I think, first off, that Red Dead Redemption 3 should not be made. Red Dead Redemption seems to imply a continuation or exploration of the plots of Arthur and John. And I don't think, or just the Van der Linde gang in general. I don't think that's what we should do. I think it should talk about something else. It should be in the same setting, but there should be different characters, there should be different locations, different things going on, a different approach to the game altogether. Anyway, let's go through his list, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about what he says, and then I will expound on what I think about what he said, if that's a yay or a nay in terms of where Red Dead should go in the future. Okay, so the first point, and I made a bulleted point and it counts up 1 to 10. He did it as a countdown 10 to 1, but whatever. I'll do it in the order I wrote it, just because otherwise I'll get confused. His first point was refined combat, and he talks specifically about some of the things that don't work super well in combat, although he mentions cover, and I've never had any real trouble with cover unless I'm trying to take cover behind something that doesn't really work super well. But I agree that I think that there is room for further refinement to combat. Combat actually works pretty well in Red Dead. I think it especially works really well in single player. The Deadeye mechanic, which I saw something very similar to it. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert on the predecessors of Red Dead. The only game I've played in that series was Red Dead Redemption 2 itself. I never played Red Dead 1. I never played Red Dead Revolver. I did, however, on the old originally Xbox, have a copy of Gun, which was a very similar game in a very similar setting, and it had some very similar mechanics. They had something very like Deadeye. I actually think combat works really quite well. That said, I'm sure there are a few things that can be done to make it a little bit tactically more interesting. But I don't pretend to know exactly what I think that they are. but I think that, yeah, some additional combat texture, some texture to the tactics would be welcome, as long as it doesn't go overboard and turn into a super technical, button masher type game, because I don't think that's what anybody wants from Red Dead. And let me, give you a little bit of context and be upfront. In fact, I was just talking to my son about this, and we were talking about the difficulty settings for games, and he's playing, Spider-Man PS4. He's replaying it right now on, ultimate difficulty, which he says is, significantly harder. I said, I don't tend to like to play games on really high difficulty, because I don't play games to challenge myself. I play games to unwind and relax. So I don't want them to be so easy that they're boring, but I don't want them to be so difficult that they frustrate me either. And so I tend to play on not necessarily the easiest setting, but on one of the easier settings until I get really good at a game, because I played it so much, and then sometimes I bump the difficulty up just because I've gotten really good at the mechanics of it. I don't think that I would be very careful with any Red Dead follow-up about making combat too technical. I don't think it needs to be any simpler than it is now, and I don't think it really needs to be any more technical. That said, I think that there are some things they could do to make it maybe a little bit more interesting. The next bullet point that he gave us was give us a reason to be bad, and he does kind of point, and again, he's talking mostly about single player. I, for a number of months now, have mostly been playing online and have not looked at single player for, I don't know, more than 6 months. And even then, the 6 months before that, I probably wasn't really playing a lot of it because I'd already finished it, and I was just kind of dabbling with stuff in the epilogue here and there. So it's true that there's some problems with being bad in Red Dead Redemption, and a lot of people have pointed this out. GTA 5, for example, the law is nowhere near all over you like it is in Red Dead, and people in general are nowhere near all over you like they are in Red Dead. It is very difficult to do anything. You are running down the street and accidentally bump into somebody, and they're shooting at you. You have to kill them in self-defense, and then you've got a huge bounty on you and half a dozen lawmen are chasing you. It's absurd. I don't think that's exactly what he meant. He's talking more about there should be some kind of actual mechanical incentives of sort, like if you are a notorious outlaw, people in town kind of give you a wide berth, treat you with more respect, whatever the case may be. Seems to be kind of what he was talking about. I think that there is a major problem with the way the law, the bounties, the wanted levels, and just the aggro of random NPCs works in Red Dead. It's better in online, but honestly, a big part of that is because there aren't as many NPCs wandering around in online as there are in single player. There's enough that it's still kind of an issue. You can't even, ride by somebody without them insulting you or threatening you, and you're just trying to pass them on your horse, and it's like, come on, give me a break, you idiot. But it's a real problem in single player, and it made free roam occasionally kind of frustrating, and I think that something needs to be fixed there. Now, it's not exactly the same as give us a reason to be bad, but I think it's give us a more realistic approach to being good or bad. If you're going to be violent, if you're going to be threatening, if you are going to be intimidating, NPCs should react appropriately rather than, the way they do, where they just aggro and swarm all over you in a ridiculous fashion when you're not even trying to draw aggro. You're just literally trying to walk down the street half the time. It's insane. The next point he says is one that I don't know that I agree with now, although I would have months ago. He said, bring back single-player DLCs. I see a lot of Red Dead fans kind of say that they want a Red Dead 2 Undead Nightmare. I think that shows an appalling lack of imagination. They already gave us Undead Nightmare. That's what Red Dead 1 had as its DLC. And sure, it was a very popular DLC, It seems to have been very successful, but it's a little bit absurd to say, let's do the same thing again. No, you should do something new. That said, a few months ago, I would have been all over a single-player DLC, and I was a little frustrated, in fact, in particular, that we didn't get the Nuevo Paraíso section, the Mexico section that John had. It's like we got this huge expanded map, but they cut part of it off, including the part, and we'll get to this in a minute, that has some of the most iconic Western scenery. They say it's in Mexico, but it looks like the Four Corners area of Utah mostly. It's got its own kind of monument valley, if you will. It's a little bit weird that we don't have that. And in fact, we do have New Austin, but you don't even get it in single player till the epilogue, and there's really not a ton to do there. There's some animals to hunt, a few towns to visit, some bounties to do, but there's a few missions for John. Even in even in online, there's honestly not a lot to do in New Austin. So to me, that was the obvious DLC that we should have got. It was like, give us more of the map and give us something to do in the map. I don't necessarily want it to be zombies, although I do really enjoy the supernatural elements of Red Dead, but they're more Easter eggs and kind of in-jokes. I do think it would be fascinating to play something like Red Dead, or a DLC for Red Dead, or a role in online for Red Dead that is sort of like Sam and Dean Winchester of the TV show Supernatural, which has been on the CW for I don't know how many seasons now, where they're basically monster hunters, or your Van Helsing, or your, that kind of role. Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the Old West. I think that would be a fascinating thing to do. I would prefer something like that to Undead Nightmare 2. But then again, there's plenty of other things that I didn't even think of that they could totally do too. Don't give us the same thing that we've already had. Give us something different. Nowadays, though, as I think online has been kind of coming together, and sure, it's got some bugs, and he mentions that briefly. A lot of people who play online a lot and talk about it on YouTube mention it. I think a lot of the complaints are a little bit overblown. It is sometimes a little frustrating. It's not as bad as it's not as bad as a lot of people say it is in the comments of YouTube videos. And I don't mean to downplay the fact that it is a little ridiculous that the bugs and glitches haven't been fixed better. But I honestly think that there's a lot that could be done to online. And as it has become more of a solo endeavor in a lot of ways, where there are other players, but you don't necessarily have to interact with them much. They don't grief you much. Back in the early days of the beta, it was just players running around murdering each other for no good reason. That has largely completely gone away. In fact, that was a huge part of the reason why I didn't play online for so long, even though I loved the single player, because I didn't want to deal with a bunch of griefers, and it just sounded super frustrating. It turns out when I finally got into it, of course, though, that is no longer really a feature of Red Dead Online. And I don't know if that's just kind of the culture that developed organically, or if some of the incentives with pressing charges and some of that other stuff has just made that happen. I'm not sure why or how that happened, but it's not a problem. So I'm kind of more like, yeah, single player DLC would be nice, but I'm totally okay with having updates continue to come through online. The online experience is pretty good. There's more that they could do to improve it. They could really fix some of the glitches with camps, with the moonshine shack, with animals not spawning. Some of those other glitches that are kind of notorious, they do need to fix them. They could add more story-like content, and we've seen a little bit in the Moonshiner role how that might look. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more of that. There should, in fact, be a lot more of that. And you could get an experience very much like a single-player DLC in online if they would just do that. So I think I don't know that I necessarily would care for another single-player DLC. I mean, I would like it. I would play it. I would buy it. I would probably enjoy it, assuming that it's reasonably well done. But I've kind of moved on from single player now, and I probably did so a lot later than almost everybody else. So I don't know. I kind of think that if they give us the content, I don't care if it comes as a single player DLC or not. I don't really want it to be Undead Nightmare again either. I think that would be boring, predictable, and just not very exciting. The next point that he makes that he would like to see is the early days of Evanderlid gang. He would like to see a prequel to the prequel where we have younger Dutch and Hosea and really young Arthur, and I completely disagree with this. And I mentioned this a little bit before I started the list. I don't want to... The Vanderlyn story is done. It's played out. Going back and exploring more esoteric prequel detail at this point would not actually make the characters any better or more interesting or even give them more depth. In fact, if anything, it would likely undermine much of what has already been done with them. I don't think that there is any good reason to do anything else with the Vanderlyn gang anymore. I think that we should explore different characters completely that have no connection other than maybe the occasional Easter egg and fan service reference to the Vanderlyns or any of the other gangs that were present in the game before. I'm a little bit unsure about how they would do it in terms of where they set it. Like I said, Red Dead Redemption kind of was on top of the same setting as Red Dead Revolver, but geographically they don't really match up very well, and it kind of feels like it's more of a reimagining in some ways than a direct sequel. Red Dead Redemption 2, on the other hand, is clearly a very direct sequel and mimics the geography of Red Dead 1 almost exactly. And in fact, there's most of the Red Dead 1 map is in Red Dead 2, and you can go see how they retextured it with more modern graphics and a more modern system. It's obviously set during a different season because places like Cochinay are in the midst of spring and there's no snow. The only snow is really high elevation up in the West Grizzlies. The East Grizzlies have wildflowers all over them. The temperatures are in the south, like Lemoyne and New Austin, rarely get above the 80s, and in fact they're often even in the 70s, and it rains all the time. It's definitely got kind of this springtime vibe, like it's around May 1st or something like that. And it was different in the first Red Dead, but other than that, the map is very much the same. They just gave us much, much more of it. Now, that said, a lot of people talk about, especially when the game was new, talked about how huge the map was. It really isn't that huge. I mean, I think that should be something that a new game does. Not only should it give us new characters, it should give us much more map. And I don't think it would feel very much like Red Dead if they redid the map tremendously. I think we just see some of the landmarks that we've come to know and love, especially towns like Blackwater, which have been, a mainstay of the game for the last 2 games. You got to have that in there somewhere. So you got to have, some overlap on the physical setting, I think. But, they should also give us a lot more of it, and they should maybe, give us, as they did in Red Dead 2, give us a reason to spend, most of our time in the new sections of the map. That said, I do feel like Red Dead 2 kind of didn't give the older section of the map what it should have. There's just not enough to do there in Red Dead 2. And it makes it feel, and it's also just because of the quirk of the geography. Like going out towards Tumbleweed and Gaptooth Ridge, it's so out of the way, and that section is so narrow that there's you just gotta just run across the scenery, and that's not very cool. There should be more reasons to do things there, more things to do, and just more in general. So again, I completely disagree. I think the Vanderlyn gang, that story's done. Don't keep messing with it. Don't keep tinkering with it. Don't George Lucas it and say, okay, now we're gonna make this little tweak and change to how things worked, what the characters are like. No. Just leave them alone. tell the story of somebody else. It's a big world. It's a big enough world. The West is not the story of one gang. It's the story of all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And they're not all gangs, by the way. Obviously, outlaws are a mainstay of the Western genre and have been since the very beginning of the genre. But in reality, the story of the West is the story of homesteaders and pioneers and people who just want to go make a living in a place where they can be free from being meddled with by overbearing, governments and local governments, state governments, overbearing, populations where there's too many people crammed together telling you how to live your life. The story of the West is the story of people looking for freedom by spreading out over a vast, largely empty wilderness and turning it into the heartland of America. That's the story of the West. And, obviously you can't tell it without bad guys. You can't tell it without some outlaws. You can't tell it without some savage Indians and all that other stuff, because those are important parts of the West. But I think it's a mistake to focus entirely and completely on outlaws and make everybody kind of a different shade of black or dark gray. I think that's a little bit absurd, and it's a little played out after 2 games of it, and more, but in particular after 2 games. I think there should be kind of a different focus. I think you should do away with the Van der Linde gang, maybe even do away with gangs entirely. Have somebody who's got a totally different motivation and reason to be out in the West. And if they deal with gangs, they're not dealing with them as a member of a gang. They're dealing with them as, gangs are something you have to watch out for. They're causing trouble. They have to navigate the politics of the gangs so that they don't get constantly attacked by them, but they do occasionally have to fight them off too, because the gangs are the bad guys, for crying out loud. I think that and I'll get to this a little bit maybe in the next point. He makes a good point, although, again, anybody who knows anything about Westerns has known this for decades. Red Dead Redemption is not really a Western. It's a revisionist Western, or an anti-Western. And the anti-Western genre was largely developed by cultural Marxists trying to deconstruct the Western. And that's what they've done. And now we are so used to it that that's what we think a Western is. We think an anti-Western is in fact a Western. I think that it would be much more interesting if we went back to the real roots of the Western genre and made something that was a little more true to life, to a real Western. The story of pioneers, the story of, people looking for room, looking for freedom, looking for solitude, looking to set up communities of like-minded people where they could kind of have each other's back, but leave behind all of the clunkiness, the problems, the conflicts, the contentions, the corruption that had become rife in the East following the Civil War in particular, but even leading up to the Civil War for that matter as well. And that, I think, is much more fertile ground than the anti-Western, which honestly is not only not even a very fun genre to begin with, it's by definition, it tries to not be fun, but it also is just kind of tired and it's too familiar. It's all anybody does is critique Western civilization and try and tell the members of Western civilization that their ancestors are the world's greatest villains and always have been. And that's absurd, it's insulting, it's racist, it's bigoted, and most importantly, I guess, in terms of an entertainment product, it's just not very interesting anymore. The next dot point, he says, is classic Western settings. And what he means by that is that Red Dead Redemption 2 is curiously doesn't take place in the West a lot. So, you start off in the Grizzlies, which is clearly an analog for somewhere in the Rockies. That's in the West. You end up kind of in the Heartlands, Valentine, and Emerald Ranch orbit for the next stage, which is the West, but by was it 1899? It's almost 1900. That's not the frontier anymore. That is fairly settled territory in a lot of ways. And it's not really what most people would consider the West. They would consider that the Midwest, not the West. Valentine is, well, I take that back. Valentine might be a town. It could be like Valentine, Nebraska, given the fact that it has the same name. And, you know, the Twin Stacks Pass and whatnot looks an awful lot like some of the stuff on western Nebraska. But that would also be really close to some of the towns of Wyoming like Cheyenne or some of those livestock towns. And I don't know, maybe that's still the West, I guess. But, you know, then we move into Rhodes, we move into St. Denis, we move into the Annesburg orbits. We're not in the West at all anymore. We're in the South, we're in the rural South, and we're in Louisiana, the bayous, and then we're in the Smokies or West Virginia or something like that. And it's a little curious that Red Dead Redemption 2 is, you know, it's considered a Western game. The setting largely isn't even in the West. New Austin gives us just a taste of it, and it's in the epilogue, and there's not a lot to do there. So I kind of agree with them. There should be a big expansion of the classic Western setting. Not that the West has to be monolithic. It's not all Monument Valley, but at the same time, you know, that is kind of the most iconic Western setting, and it's shockingly small in Red Dead Redemption 2. I think any subsequent Red Dead properties, titles, or updates should really kind of expand the West. We don't need more of the Roanoke Ridge Appalachians. We don't need more of Lemoyne and kind of the South. Although as an ethnic Southerner myself, I find Lemoyne really quite interesting, especially the Scarlet Meadows area, which reminds me an awful lot in some ways of where I grew up, just in terms of what it looks like. But, you know, still at the same time, that's my father's people were from the South. My mother's people were you know, New Englanders who went west, you know, with kind of the early ways of pioneers. And so the West is also in my blood. I'm a little disappointed there isn't a little bit more of the West, the classic kind of Western West in particular. The scenery in New Austin is surprisingly kind of understated. It's pretty. There's some nice canyons and nice buttes and mesas and whatnot. But the really dramatic stuff, you can barely see it across the river in Mexico. And if you know, glitch yourself into the Mexico portion, you can ride around in it. And if you play Red Dead 1, of course, you can see more of it. But I think we really kind of desperately needed that to be in the game. And there needed to be more to do in that area. And we needed more reasons to spend time in that area. And, you know, probably, honestly, the stuff that was... And there's an awful lot of map that's built up, although it's not textured and there's not anything to do in it. There's an awful lot of map that is north of New Austin and west of West Elizabeth. And it's a shame that we don't have more to do out there and have more of a map that, you know, instead of a circle with a long tail, like kind of like a raccoon hat, it should be, you know, more square or rounded or something so we can get around more easily and not feel constrained by the geography. So I 100% agree with him here. Where I 100% disagree with him is the next one where he says more Native Americans. Now, and I don't, actually just based on just that, I don't disagree with him, although I will take exception to the term Native American, which I think is absurd. The Native Americans are neither Native nor Americans. We know where they came from, most of them, because of genetic research and cultural research, archaeological research. We know they're not native. Yeah, sure, they were here before the European descended people like me were, but they're still not natives. They didn't come from here. They came from somewhere else, the same as we did. So they're not natives, and more particularly, they're not Americans, because America was a nation founded by primarily British with a little bit of German and other European colonists on the eastern seaboard and spread out from there. America is not just a geographical expression, and anybody who lives within the confines or borders of what is America as an American. The Indians are not Americans. They are their own nations. Give them some respect and some credit. They are not Americans. They are Comanche. They are Chippewa. They are Kiowa. They are Apache. They are Cherokee. They are, whatever, Creek, whatever else they may be. That's who they are. They're not Americans. They've got their own culture. They've got their own traditions. They've got their own genetics. I actually think it would be interesting to be able to do a little bit more with them. I think it'd be interesting to be able to, especially in online, if we could create characters that looked like them, if we could create characters that dressed like them, if we had more clothing that looked more Indian-like. I think it would be interesting if we had stories or characters, even if they're NPCs, although this would be an interesting idea for a protagonist in a future game. Somebody like the girl in The Searchers, who ended up, her family was killed by the Comanches, her family of settlers and homesteaders. They were totally slaughtered by the Comanches. But then for whatever reason, and the Comanches in real life did do this on occasion, they adopted her into the tribe. And she spent many years with them. And she kind of had conflicted loyalties, because she was an American and she knew it. But she had also spent many years living as a Comanche, and she kind of had some loyalty to that way of life. That was a real thing, even further east. That was a real thing with some of the Americans, as some of the boys in particular who just didn't have the patience for civilization found the Indian way of life attractive, and often would try to kind of run off and become hunters and whatnot in the woods. And I don't know, I think that there could be some really interesting interactions. Of course, this stupid British simp doing this video, the only thing he can think of is this totally woke narrative about, the evil white man persecuted the poor red man. That is kind of a load of baloney. And if you actually read any primary sources, and there's an awful lot to read. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitness accounts of the savagery of the Indians, even the Indians on the East Coast. The Iroquois, for example, are recorded multiple times in their wars with the Algonquin peoples as, capturing them, torturing them, raping them, cooking them, eating them. These were not nice cultures. These were not the kind of Greenpeace hippies that today's idiot SJWs imagine them to be. And likewise, the Americans were not these villainous overlords taking things over. They were people who were looking to do what was right. They were looking to get away from people messing with them, and they were looking to just kind of build their own life in peace. And I think, again, this is kind of the difference between the Western and the anti-Western. The Western had typically more heroic characters, more sympathetic settlers and cowboys. But that said, the Indians weren't necessarily always villains here either. The Americans always kind of respected the Indians, or at least some aspects of Indian culture. And that's why the Lone Ranger always had Tonto. That's why most of these movies from the 50s, before cultural Marxism really kind of came into place, the Indians were not necessarily seen as villains. They could be antagonists, but they rarely were villains. And this is actually almost historically inaccurate, because, like I said, in reality, the Indians were violent. They were violent to each other. They were violent to the white men. The Comanche in particular, they rolled back the Apacheria. They rolled back the Sioux. Every other Indian tribe hated them because they were so violent and savage. They rolled back the white advance in Texas and elsewhere. They rolled back the Spanish advance. They were not nice people, in this, kind of peace-loving, cry a single tear over poor white man destroying the land. What a load of nonsense. Complete nonsense. Give these characters the depth that they deserve. Do not just say, okay, well, in the 50s, and this isn't even true, but this is what they say. In the 50s Westerns, all the Americans were the good guys, and if they even had black people or women or Indians, they were treated as second-class citizens or villains. That wasn't even true, but even if it was, the total flipping of it, where white men are always the villains and everybody else is always the poor, oppressed underdog hero. Oh my gosh, just stop. Just stop. Do not do that. Red Dead Redemption 2 has way too much of that already. The last thing it needs is more, and yet this is exactly what this guy from What Culture wants. He wants to turn Red Dead into a woke lecture, and somehow he thinks that will make it more fun. It will make it a better game. He's delusional. Delusional. Look at what is happening to every movie that has come out in the last couple of years. There's a reason why people say, get woke, go broke. Don't get woke, Rockstar. Absolutely not. 100% disagree with this. I do agree with the point that there should be something with the Indians. You know, this Wapiti tribe, sure, do something with them. Let us be able to create characters that look like them or dress like them and interact with them. But, you know, no, we don't need to explore the nuances of Wapiti culture, which, you know, would be based on, and this guy is just name dropping historical events where he thinks that he makes them look really cool because he can refer to Wounded Knee and some of these other things. He talks specifically about the poor oppression of the Chinese, and, you know, give me a frickin' break. Seriously, give me a break. Absolutely do not do that. That is exactly, you do that, I guarantee the game will flop. That is a disaster waiting to happen. Do not do that. That is Birds of Prey. That is Ghostbusters 2016. That is all of these movies that are flopping over the last couple of years. That's Soilo. Do not do that. Absolutely do not do that. Your core audience is white men. If you think that it is smart to constantly insult your core audience and make them out as the villains all the time, how in the world do you think you're going to have a successful franchise? No. It is time to actually cater to the core audience again and say, you know what? Instead of constantly slandering and dogpiling on you, your history, your ancestors. And you know, the other thing too, we're not going to do that anymore. The other thing, like I said, this guy who did this video for What Culture, he's talking about, you know, Americans and this darker chapters in their history that they've forgotten. Who does he think he's kidding? That is all of the history that anybody ever teaches us anymore. All that they do is cherry pick the absolute worst things that they could find. They exaggerate them. In many cases, they embellish them beyond anything that's factual. And that is the only thing that they teach us. There is a huge section of our history that has been forgotten. It's the exact opposite of what he thinks it is. What we should have that has been forgotten, that needs to be brought back, is the story of brave, heroic, community-minded, fairly righteous people who are homesteaders and pioneers and trappers and explorers who are just out there trying to make a good life for themselves and their posterity and help each other out along the way. That is really the story of the West, and that is the history that's been forgotten, not the history of, oh my gosh, we oppressed somebody else. Come on, give me a break. No, that's absolutely the worst thing that could possibly be done. Don't do that. The next one he says is more of the same, lean into social realities. This is where he talks a lot about, we really need to explore the oppression. We really should have protagonists who are black or Indian or women. You know, again, this is get woke, go broke. Do not do that. The next thing he says, though, is more cities. And it is true that, in the first game, Blackwater was kind of the significant urban center where you went to go do a bunch of stuff because they had amenities there. In the second game, although you have Blackwater, you can't access it unless you're playing online or in the epilogue. However, you get some towns, and it's interesting how they designed it. Valentine is actually the most well-rounded of the towns, even though it's small. You can do almost anything you want in Valentine without having to go anywhere else. Rhodes is the next one you see. The only thing Valentine doesn't have is a fence, although there's one in Rhodes and there's one at Emerald Ranch, which are not that far away. Rhodes doesn't have a lot of the same, has a lot of the stuff that Valentine does, but not everything. There's no barber, there's no doctor, there's no, some of that other stuff, but it has most of that other stuff. Then Saint Denis, of course, is obviously the city that has it all and really is a legitimate city. And, it's just a different kind of experience. And, it's interesting because the game often, focuses, even though it spends a lot of time outside of the cities, it focuses an awful lot on the cities, and you're drawn to the cities for different reasons all the time. And I do think that there's, he's right, there are some period appropriate cities in America that could be used as models to draw from to give us more. Give us an 1880s version of Denver, or Deadwood, or San Francisco even, or San Diego, or I don't know. I mean, there's tons of Chicago. I don't know. There's so many he could do that they could do, and I think that if they expand the map, one of the things that it should have is another big city, or at least Blackwater scale, if not even bigger. And I agree with him that I think that that's something that I'd like to see. The next thing he says is the golden age of outlaws. And this is an interesting point, because I have always thought it was really odd that the first Red Dead Redemption game takes place when the Old West is really already gone. It doesn't exist anymore in, 1911 or whatever it takes place in. Even in Red Dead 2, which takes place quite a bit earlier, and depending on if you're playing the epilogue or the main story, it's right around the turn of the century. Even then, the Old West was really already gone, and these are kind of like hangers-on who are trying to desperately grasp at straws at a way of life that's already gone. It's been gone for years already at the time that the game takes place, and it's a little bit bizarre that the game is so insistent on setting the game at kind of the end of the era rather than smack dab in the golden age of the era. And I kind of agree with him. I'd like to see more 1870s, 1880s type of setting. Let's do that. That's where it should be set. And again, that doesn't mean young Dutch and Hosea. It means let's have a totally different cast of characters. Let's have a frontier that's maybe a little more untamed. Because really, what's untamed about Red Dead 2? You got gang hideouts, sure, and in the story missions, there's stuff that happens, but it's really kind of more crime stuff than it is, frontier stuff, if that makes any sense. And I'm not sure that it does, but I think part of it is driven by the setting, is that they're trying to make a cowboy game and they're trying to set it after the cowboys kind of already weren't a thing anymore. And it really needs to be a generation earlier. It needs to be 20, even 30 years earlier. And I agree with him there. Although, again, I think it should have totally new characters. The last point that he makes, and I disagree with this too, is Landon Ricketts. Landon Ricketts is, actually he's not really a thing in Red Dead 2 at all, so I had to kind of look him up and remember who he was. He was kind of a background character in Red Dead 1, who was an older guy who had supposedly been a notorious gunslinger during the golden age of outlaws and cowboys. Again, though, I don't really want to see... I'm shocked at the lack of imagination that can't imagine stepping beyond the characters we already have. I mean, quite honestly, if we're going to go back, I'd rather see a remake of Red Dead Revolver, except remade and remastered into something much more, modern than what it was, something more along the lines of the tone of Red Dead 2. I would rather see that than, here's a character, kind of this side character that we're going to turn into a main character. But honestly, I don't know why you'd want to do either one. Just do some new characters. Start over. Tell a different story. Give us something that we haven't already seen. What is the point of tinkering with the details of a story that's already told? No. Landon Ricketts, no. He can be, He can be a side character. He can be somebody that you come across. He can be somebody you hear about. But make that, if anything, it's just an Easter egg. It's a reference for the fans. Do not make the story of Landon Ricketts Red Dead Redemption 3. Please do not do something like that. Just give us new characters. Give us something new. Give us a new story. Give us something that's more imaginative than, trotting out leftovers and warming them up in the microwave. That is the last thing that Red Dead Redemption 3 or whatever future titles the Red Dead series has. That's the last thing it needs. So anyway, let me know if you agree or disagree with anything that I said. Actually, I don't care. I don't care what you think. I'm not going to change my mind anyway. But, whatever. If you feel like you want to comment or talk about this, feel free to do so.